Now it's time to speak about a central concept in Ascended called close combat. Close combat can be decisive in a game, and it's an opportunity for players to score points by damaging your opponent. First, in order for me to enter close combat with my opponent, during my move phase, I have to move my model into my opponent's tile. First, I will move through 2 terrain tiles, which is my movement allowance during darkness, and then move an extra terrain tile, at the cost of 2 energy, once per turn, as Magnus' Zor profile allows me to do that. Next, I have to resolve close combat. Here I reference Magnus' Zor ability that says when attacking, opponents must test for stealth before combat. So my opponent will do that now. We pass the test. Next, I will resolve close combat through 3 easy steps. The first one is to determine combat skill and base combat dice pool for both players. Combat skill is equal to the terrain difficulty, plus other card bonuses that might be in play. Neither me or my opponent has any combat bonuses in play from other cards, so combat skill will be equal to the terrain difficulty. Terrain difficulty is represented by the numbers on the corners of each terrain tile. So for example, I attack from this terrain tile through this edge, so the terrain difficulty and the combat skill will be 1. My opponent is defending his terrain tile from these 2 edges, so his terrain difficulty and consequently his combat skill will be equal to 2. This means that in order to have a success, he will have to roll 2 or higher, and I will have to roll 3 or higher. Next, the combat dice pool. Combat dice pools are composed of base combat dice, which are dice generated by your active mutations in their type, and the companion's combat bonus, which are dice generated by companions. The attacking player will generate all of his dice as attacking dice, or thrust dice as we call it, while the defender will generate all of his dice as defending dice, or parry dice. Attacking dice, when uncancelled, will cause damage to your opponent. And parry dice that are successful will cancel out successful attacking or thrust dice. So let's see how many dice each one of us generates. If you take a look at the table on page 8 of your rulebook, the attacker will generate 3 dice for each body mutation he has. In our case, I will generate 3. And 1 dice for each soul mutation he has. I have 2 soul mutations, so I'll generate 2 dice. Plus, Magnus Zor rolls an extra base combat dice for each opponent's superstition tokens. My opponent has 1, so I'll add an extra base combat dice because of this. My base combat dice is 6, to which I'll add now the combat bonus of my companions, which is 2 for the thief and 2 for the wizard. This gives me a total of 10 attacking or thrust dice. Now for my opponent. My opponent has 2 geotype mutations, which add, when defending, 2 dice each. Plus, he has 1 body type mutation, which adds 1 base combat dice when defending. Finally, he has the woodsman, which is a companion that adds 2 dice. His total is 7 parry dice. Now let's just check if any of our mutations alters the number of base combat dice that you roll. I have 1. Mind Control says that in close combat I can reduce 1 opponent base combat dice for each of my active soul mutations. Since I have 2, I will reduce 2 dice from my opponent, leaving him with a total of 5. Finally, before we roll dice, and starting with the defender, each player can change any number of his generated dice from thrust to parry dice and vice versa, changing his dice at the cost of 1 control per dice. None of us will do that right now, but it's important for you to know, since it's a strategical decision you may take during the game. The second step is each player then rolls his combat dice and compares the result. First, let's roll my dice. I have 10 dice. And remember, I need 3 or more to have success. I rolled 4 successful hits. Now it's my opponent's turn. He will roll 5 dice, needing 2 or more to have success. All of his dice were successes, so he cancelled out my 4 successful hits. None of us actually inflicted any damage on each other, so no damage is allocated. If I were to inflict damage on my opponent, he could allocate the damage I inflicted on his health scale or on his companion. And the same with my case. Since it was a tie and none of us actually dealt damage to each other, the losing player is the player that attacked. My opponent would be able to choose to which terrain tile adjacent to his own would I retreat to. He would probably choose this one, which has a lower terrain difficulty. None of us scored any damage, so none of us scored any points. If we were to deal damage either through companions or through base combat dice, we will add points to the point scale. Okay. Now let's see if I can take control of a terrain tile. During my move phase, I'll move into the castle tile. The next step is the decide phase. So at the beginning of the decide phase, I'll choose to test for stealth. I failed the test, since my control level is 5 and I rolled an 8. This is the last superstition token to be activated. There are no more inactive superstition tokens left. So what happens now is that the populace revolts, and through the leader, the Inquisitor, which is the magistrate, they will launch an attack called the Great Witch Hunt, in which they will hunt each of us and deal damage. First, let's read the special rule the magistrate has, that for each roll of a 6 on this villain's combat dice, you immediately test for stealth. The Inquisitor will then attack each player in the proportion of the number of active superstition tokens it has. So it will roll 4 dice for me and 1 dice for my opponent. We cannot defend against this attack, and our combat skill is the highest value of terrain difficulty of our current terrain tile. In my case is 3, in my opponent's case is 1. So for my opponent, the magistrate has to roll 2 or higher. He rolls a 6, which means my opponent immediately tests for stealth. He passed the test. As for me, he needs 4 or higher, since the terrain difficulty is 3. He rolled 1-4, so I lose a hit point. After this is done, you discard the Inquisitor, you draw a new Inquisitor, and you place all of the superstition tokens equal to the villain's combat skill, combat bonus, on top of the Inquisitor. Starting the whole process again.